Very good. So we're going to get started with the lecture tonight that is going to take us to the birth of Colorado and the reason why it was founded. This part of the country that was named the Great American Desert, that it was not a good place for humans to be here. It actually started because of resources, gold that was found in the state. And a lot of people know about the gold that was found in Cherry Creek and the Platte River and Clear Creek and all of that. But while people were busy looking for gold there were some explorers that actually went somewhere else in the state on the what was or what is the South Park Basin, and to a region called a time at history that's called the Tarryall's gold. So we're going to talk about how those people explored that place and they found gold. And for this, we're going to have an expert on that topic, actually wrote the book about this, Mark Hanson, that earned a degree in geology and also on archaeology from the University of North Dakota. But most importantly, he's an ore digger. He graduated with a master's from the Colorado School of Mines. I just had to say that. And that's where he learned most of the important geology. And but he has been very much interested on this topic and wrote a book called Tarryall Gold From Rush to Hush. And actually, he's going to have his book on sale after the talk. So make sure you pay attention so that then you can later on buy the book. So with that, Mark, it's a pleasure to have you here. All right, so
all right. Well, thank you, Adel. And also thank you to Rocky Mountain Map Society and History Colorado for hosting tonight. What I'd like to do is introduce you folks to a place that's very special to me, Tarryall Valley. It was actually the very first stampede into Colorado's central Colorado from the Front Range in the gold rush of 1859. And today, it's essentially a time capsule of over 120 years of gold exploration and production. So what I'd like to do is to introduce you to some of the miners, the mines, and the maps that brought them to the gold in Tarryall Valley. Well, if any of you know of Tarryall, there's a whole bunch of them in central Colorado, so I'd like to get you local to where we're actually talking. This map will focus in on the South Park Basin to the southwest of Denver. And we'll see that it's bounded on its east side by the Front Range, on the north by the Continental Divide, and on the west by the Mosquito Range and the Sawatch Range. Whoops. All right, we'll zoom in on the basin right there. Now, most of you are pretty familiar with this basin because you've come in along Highway 285, and you've come through Conifer and Bailey, and then up over Kenosha Pass. And then you'll go through the great big city of Jefferson and past the Little Como. And if you reach Fairplay, well, you've really missed the subject of tonight's talk, which is Tarryall Valley. And that sits just to the north and to the west of the town of Como, tucked right up under the Continental Divide. Let's take a picture from Kenosha Pass. This will be a view that many of you be familiar with. I'm standing here on the railroad grade of the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad. And we're looking out onto Highway 285 that moves across here and looking out onto portions of the Continental Divide. And that is flanked by two 13ers, Mount Silverheels on the left and Mount Guyot on the right. Tarryall Valley is located right at the base of Mount Silverheels. Well, one of the things I like to do is get a sense for what were these explorers, what did they have for maps coming into this area, and what was known about this area. So I've taken this map made by Colton in 1856, and we're going to look at some of the significant early exploration challenges of these guys that were coming in here. And first, of course, would be the topography. And as I've looked at a number of these maps from 1856 to back 20 or 30 years, there's two features that always show up on these maps, and that is Long's Peak and Pike's Peak. And of course, the reason for that is Zebulon Pike's expedition in 1806 and Stephen Long's expedition in 1820. Now, sometime after that, quite a number of forts would pop up along the Front Range. to protect the travelers and the traders and the trappers. And then there was a number of other explorers. Most probably importantly was Fremont, and he had quite a number of trips through here that he did mapping with from 1843 to 45. And then, of course, we had the California Gold Rush, which made for the Cherokee Trail that came through in 1849. And you guys had a talk here a couple months ago on that. And then Captain Gunnison and Captain Stansbury in 1843 and 1850. And so this is kind of the framework that a lot of these early maps are using in terms of really having great survey data of where they all were located. Now, of course, if we take a look, that's where Denver is going to be, right there at Cherry Creek and South Platte. And Tarryall Valley is off to the southwest of that. And so you see Tarryall Valley is rather unexplored at this time by these major explorers, but of course the Indians and the trappers had a pretty good idea of how to get around here. All right, the second early exploration challenge would be political. And this map from 1856 shows kind of the status of the United States at that time. The slave states would be obviously the southern in black there, and then the red would be the free states. Now, the territory of Kansas, which many people would travel across, was a state that was, or a territory that was in transition, and the citizens of that territory were to make the decision of whether they were to be slave or free. And of course, this turns into a very bleeding Kansas, kind of a guerrilla war. And some of you have heard of John Brown, who made his start in a number of massacres out there during that time. And last of all would be the Indian crisis or the Indian challenge. And of course, this is a map made in 1895, and it was called a Sessions map, what was ceded by the different tribes to the United States. And so you see in this territory, there's two main tribes, the combined Arapaho Cheyenne, which are largely on the eastern portion of the state, and then the Ute on the western part of the state. You'll note the kind of precarious position of Tarryall Valley there, right exactly on the boundary of those two warring tribes. Now, what were they warring over? Well, probably a lot of things, but main was that South Park was a huge game preserve for them. That was where their food supply was. It was full of buffalo, full of antelope, deer, and both of those tribes really claimed that as their own. So there was a constant war going on between those tribes. And the early explorers would suffer the consequences of that. This would be one of the first pictures I've found of the Tarryall Valley. And so we see Mount Silver Hills in the distance, Tarryall Valley going in on the right. And of course, what I love about this picture is all the teepees here. I'm not sure if that's Ute or Arapaho Cheyenne, but we're at the very north end, and you can see that it was quite populated by that, whichever tribe was there during this picture. Now, if we fade into today, you'll see almost the exact same scene, other than not any of the teepees, obviously. And this is sitting about 2 miles north of the town of Como, and it's right before you cross the Tarryall Creek. Well, let's take a quick look at the gold rush and just do a little bit of a review. In 1858 and then 1859, the immigrants were coming across, and primarily in 1859, we have, in May of 1859, John Gregory announces the discovery of what would become the Gregory Lode in around Black Hawk. And George Jackson announced about the same time his discovery, which had been made a few months earlier in January of that year, out in the present-day location of Idaho Springs. So if you keep your eye on this ball, we're going to use that ball on a number of slides, and that's really where all the immigrants in 1859 are heading towards. I mean, they're coming across looking for the Gregory diggings, thousands and thousands and thousands packing into that little ball. And it's a fairly limited area, and probably within about 6 to 8 weeks, that is largely filled up. All the claims are taken, and you have a second rush, which is basically a rush back east, where many people have called this now a humbug. It's just a limited little spot. There's no space for anyone else. And so many people returned back east. But of course, there were many intrepid few that weren't about to give up. And so our first explorers would have made a trek something like this out into South Park. And you can see this is at least a 45-mile hike, and you can see the topography they would have to do to get there. So let's look at really the first explorers that we know of to almost make it there. This is Dr. Schenck, Bart Kennedy, and William Slaughter. Unfortunately for these men, they were set upon by a band of Ute Indians on June 26th, and Dr. Schenck and Dr. Kennedy, or Bart Kennedy, were murdered. Ironically, a man by the name of Slaughter survived the slaughter, and he hightailed it back up to the Gregory diggings. And you might think this would be a significant damper to further exploration in this direction, but nothing could be further from the truth. Within a couple of weeks, 14 men came up over Kenosha Pass, 8 of those from the Gregory diggings, and 6 of them straight out of Wisconsin. And they would have met up around the area of Kenosha Pass and decided, with all the opposition that the previous explorers had met, that they would combine forces as they went into South Park. So this would be about the trek that they would have taken, and they would have walked across Jefferson Creek and Michigan Creek and tried their luck panning there. And then when they arrived at this spot, their pans began to fill with gold. And they said, let's Tarryall here, which is how they got the name. Now, this is the area of my study area over the last 10 years, really all the confluences or the headwaters of the Tarryall. And this is a very prominent gold producer. In fact, just within this gold ellipse here, some $200 to $300 million worth of gold were produced in the value of today's gold. Well, let's look at the kind of the demographics of these discoveries. If I were to take a poll of how old you think the average explorer was there, I think we'd all probably be wrong. Let's look at some of these. This is W.J. Curtis. He was kind of the leader of the band. He was 32. Of course, this picture was taken later. Morris Spillard was 42. W.J. Holman was 40. And so you look at these guys were leaving their wives and their families behind. There was the Depression of 1857 that just happened. I mean, these guys are just certainly looking for a fortune, but they're probably looking just for a living as well. If you look at some of the other guys that I was able to track down, we got Earl Hamilton, 26, 27-year-old John Williams, and 42-year-old Catesby Dale. These guys, it's important to know, they did not tarry all for very long. In fact, within a couple of years, there would be only about a handful of those left. Most of them would sell out to the next immigrants that came through. And others, like Clark Chambers, would either move back to the east to fight in the Civil War. Unfortunately for Clark Chambers, he joined the Cavalry 1st Colorado Infantry, and he went down to Glorieta Pass, where he was killed in that battle. Well, let's look at what's called the Colorado Mineral Belt. In the upper right-hand corner, you have the map of Colorado, and this gold band coming around is really what holds many of the mineral deposits in the state of Colorado. And we're just zooming in essentially from about Boulder down to Gunnison in this map. And here's our gold ball showing that Idaho Springs Black Hawk area. And let's look at the jump that the discoverers of the Tarryall made. You can see that they went across or around quite a few deposits. And again, in July 13th, they would land at that location. Within very little time, less than a month, explorers would be going up over what we call Hoosier Pass and Boreas Pass and discovering the gold deposits, rich gold deposits of Breckenridge and Summit County. A week after that, Fairplay was discovered. In the next month, Buckskin Joe and Lorette, just to the west of Alma, were found. And Montgomery was found at the base of Hoosier Pass late in 1859. And so I think you can see this really drove the exploration down across the state. And that's why I call it really is the first stampede from Colorado's Front Range. And in doing so, that it becomes then a gateway to Central Colorado's mines, and I'll show that in a bit, and really an early supply hub for thousands and thousands of immigrants that would be coming across the state. Well, let's look at some of the earliest known maps, and this is thanks to Wes Brown, who donated this map to Denver Public Library. And it's one of the earliest I see that actually has the towns named on it. So we see Tarryall City and Hamilton, right, kind of dueling towns across the Tarryall Creek. Some comparisons were being made initially to Aurora and Denver. That didn't quite pan out. But you see diagrammatically a number of the, or just kind of a sense for where some of the claims would be up on the Tarryall Creek to the north. And then these long linear pieces up here are meant to be, they're again, kind of theorized, the lode claims where they'd be going up dip or upstream to find that lode gold or the mother lode. And it's interesting to see on this map what they named some of these. None of these ever show up in literature, but they have the Wisconsin lode, the Minnesota lode, the New York lode. And so I think this was somewhat of an advertisement for people to buy more maps that were heading out in this direction. All right, a year later, we have this map drawn by Ebert. It's 1862. And this is a great map. I love this in terms of what it shows. Again, the Hamilton is now on that map. We have the towns of Fairplay and Lorette and Breckenridge all put on there. And one of my favorites, because it's kind of in my backyard, it shows the location of Bradford, which was kind of at the start of the Bradford Toll Road. And we see that Bradford settlement in Carroll Ranch, and it's somewhere in the North Ranch. If you'd ever haven't seen that, it's really kind of a notable little historic site. And again, the Bradford Road was really one of the first roads into Hamilton. It was the first road in 1860. There were two other roads on this map that are showing up. Of course, if you were coming around on the Santa Fe Trail or possibly the Cherokee Trail, you might turn off at Colorado City or Colorado Springs and make your way over Ute Pass. This was a pretty tough trail in the 1860 timeframe. Or if you're coming up the Arkansas to Canyon City, you'd move up over Current Creek Pass and then into the Tarryall. But really the main one for most of the immigrants that are coming into Denver is going to be that Bradford Toll Road. Well, let's put all three of these on a Google map just to get an idea again how Tarryall Valley really is the hub of the exploration at that time. That Discover's trail would be about where that white line is. We have the Bradford Trail, the Ute Pass Trail, and then the Current Creek Pass. This news article or advertisement is put in the paper by W.J. Holman, one of the discoverers and now the agent of the Tarryall Town Company. And it comes out in April of 1861. And what you'll see, it says, "Hope for the land of gold and silver. Are you from Denver City? Tarryall City is on your way to California Gulch, Fairplay, Buckskin Joe, Breckenridge." And so you have this whole list. Are you from Colorado City? Are you from Canyon City? And it just emphasizes what we can see now, just that was the hub. And these are the spokes bringing in all the explorers into that area of Colorado. All right, let's look down at that location. This is the road to Boreas Pass. I hope most of you have experienced the beautiful autumns out there, but we're looking back to the south, to the town of Como, and we're looking right over the former town of Tarryall City and Hamilton. And this is where that Denver Blue River Bradford Road would have come in at the time, and it would have headed up about to where I'm standing on the Boreas Pass. Well, I say, let the stampede begin. One of the reasons, or one of the really cool ways of looking at these rushes and finding out information is Colorado Historic Newspapers allows you to look at every newspaper, virtually every newspaper all the way back to the rush. And so I put on these golden dots here a numbered different news articles about how rich this land was. And of course, we all know that what's in the newspaper is absolutely true, but it gives you a kind of a starting point for what was going on out here. And so I'll just look at a few of them. Number 3, which is at the confluence of the North and the Middle Tarryall, the Bowers brothers bought into that discovery very early, and they were making 2.7 ounces of gold per man per day. And this represents almost 19 times the daily average wage of a worker at that time, which was about $3. So very prolific area. This map, or this photo, was taken in 1912 after most of the work had been done in that confluence. So we have, here's the North Tarryall, here's the Middle Tarryall. So those numbers would have come right from this area, and you can see the large number of gravels that have been moved at that time. If we fade into what we're seeing today, a very similar scene, a lot of it reclaimed by the beautiful forests out there, but we still see certainly a footprint of that early mining. All right, we'll look at 1 month after the start of the Civil War, so May of 1861. That valley is producing at that time $5,000 worth of gold per day. And that sounds like, well, that sounds not too bad, but that was at $20 an ounce. In today's price, that's almost $750,000 worth of gold coming out every day. So a lot of gold and a lot of value. And you have an entrepreneurial young man named John Parsons, and he pulls a wagon out here with a mint on the back of it and starts to mint gold coins. And he starts minting $5 and $2.50 coins, and 11 of these exist today, so they're very rare. And just a plug for Colorado School of Mines, the museum out there, Free Mineral Museum, they've got a display of many of the early gold coins Colorado mints, and one of those 11 is in that display. Well, as you might imagine, this is going to spur a lot of early settlements out in this area. And I talked about the discovery at Tarryall City, Hamilton, the Tarryall diggings where the Bowers brothers were. And most of these would be because of the placer gold. That is the gold that was found in the gravels and washed out in the dust and the nuggets, if you're lucky. There was quite an effort to find that mother lode in this valley. And so there were several sites also that were started looking for that mother lode, the little settlement of Oregon, Silver Hills, and Jarvis Camp. Now, I find the funnest way to tell this story is just to take a look at several of the miners and some of the maps. I've kind of customized this one to the miners that we have some maps associated with their discoveries. And so we'll first look at 5 of the placer miners, and then we'll look at one of the lode miners. Really, about 99.8% of the gold found out here was in the placers, but it certainly wasn't because of lack of effort in the lode community. So we'll start out with a gentleman named William Liebelt. He's a German man, and he comes into the Tarryall Valley 10 years after the start of the gold rush. And I call him the gold farmer. He came in here in 1869, and he settled for the rest of his life there for 40 years. And he aggregated 152 acres of placer land, which he claimed and really mined virtually all by himself. He had a brother named Herman who was helpful off and on, but he really did most of it all by himself. And there's documented cases of gold nuggets from 4 to 6 ounces that he was finding back there. A very prolific miner and very thorough. Well, at some point, Mr. Liebelt got lonely, and he sent his brother Herman back to Germany to find him a wife. And before he did, this was told to me by his great-grandchildren, he took a piece of paper, he tore it in 2, and he gave half of it to his brother and said, "I'll meet the lady that you find in Denver, and if our papers fit, that's the one you found for me." And so he found Susanna, and she came up to an elevation of 10,902 feet, and there they raised 6 children together. Now, anybody else most men up here would leave this valley at the end of October, come back in April, because if you've been up here in the winter, it's a pretty fearsome spot, lots of snow. But not William. He would badger under those gravels, recover the rich gravels on the bedrock, and hold them out until the spring thaw would come. Well, unfortunately, 4 years after this picture was taken, Susanna was passed away, and she was buried up on the side of the hill there. And so now he has 6 children and 152 acres of placer to work. This is the first surveyed map of his claims. It was a 16-acre claim, you see right here, made in January 3rd, 1873. And you see the 2 creeks, Little French Gulch and Deadwood Gulch, which joined to form the headwaters of the Tarryall Creek. The next map we see is 15 years later, and he's now amassed that 150 acres and put this all together. And I love these claim maps. They tell you a lot of things, and especially if you're trying to do kind of an archaeological study along with the economic study that I was doing. And so let's look at some of the things that you can find on these maps. Obviously, where is the river? We see that. Where are some of the dams that Liebelt and his predecessors built to hold that water throughout the summer so that they could mine the entire season? And then there are ditches and flumes that go off of these maps and intersect those creeks much higher and bring the high-pressured water down to the placer faces. And also then you see down in the corner, it says houses. These were needed to be put on the maps to prove to the surveyors and the government that they'd put a certain amount of labor and time into that claim. This is actually the original log house of Mr. Liebelt, I'd say before the 6 children came along. And then one of my favorite things to look for are these corner markers on the claims. And you'll see in this claim map, it says survey number 5236, and it points to that corner right there. And you see inscribed on the rock 5236, that's corner number 7. There's corner number 7 right now, or right there. And you can imagine after 140 years, most of these are pretty much buried with pine needles and pine cones, but on occasion, you get lucky and run into one of those. All right, this is my mapping that I did, again, over the last 10 years. All the red marks out there are the flumes and the ditches that were carved into the ground to intercept the upper reaches of these creeks and bring it down into the placer, which is marked here in blue. And then I've also marked where I found different pipelines, towers, dams, gates, all the different components of that hydraulic system as they exist today. This is a photo just looking north into Mr. Liebelt's claim, and we can see just the prodigious amount of rock work that he's moved. This is the little creek right here that he took all his gold out of, and just an amazing man. Now, in every mining district, you have to have some legends and lore, and certainly Liebelt was the prime candidate for this. Many, many stories about what he may or may not have found. And this mining report at the School Mines Library talks about, in 1933, it says he was a very secretive man and no one ever knew how much gold he produced. There has always prevailed a rumor that at the time of his death, he had a large cache of gold hid away in the mountains. And so I've been able to interview some of his great-grandchildren and look into some of these rumors and I think maybe come to some conclusions on some of those fables, or not those tales, or those legends, I guess. All right, Leland Peabody came over here in 1863. And at first, he did not settle in the valley. He was on his way up over Breckenridge Pass, which is called today Boreas Pass, and went into and bought into the Gold Run placer in Breckenridge. 12 years later, he comes back over and takes the gold, his profits from the Gold Run placer, and buys into what would be called the Peabody placer of Park County. By 1878, he was employing 15 men. So think again, Liebelt was working 152 acres by himself. Peabody was working this hard. And this is a good picture taken about 1879. And there's Leland over standing all by himself and his workers. And then behind him is what's called a giant or a monitor. It's basically a water cannon that breaks up the gravels for that gold. Now, how can I know that this was about 1879? Well, all these men are white. And they made about $3 a day, which was pretty good wages. Well, Leland and many miners of the time figured out that the Chinese would work for about $1 a day. And so by 1892, he has 55 Chinese men working these claims. And by doing that, you obviously could extend the economics of your placer mining quite a ways. All right, this is a survey map of his acreage on his Peabody placer. This is 74 acres, so about half of what Mr. Liebelt had. And we'll zoom in on that just a little bit and again show you where this is now the Tarryall Creek. It's come to the Deadwood and Little French have come together to Tarryall Creek. And we have a dam, a large dam that was built down near the end of this claim. And we'll fill that up with water and bring in a couple of ditches and flumes that were brought in to wash those placer faces. And then the main placer face in the Peabody placer is here at the southeast end. Well, let's look at a couple pictures of what that looked like at the time. First of all, we'll look up towards Mount Silver Hills, and we see all these gravels that have been washed. This is a railroad bridge right here that would go up over Boreas Pass. And I've placed the man about it, the exact spot where they would have been many years earlier. If we look at how that looks today, very similar in many ways. Certainly, nature is kind of overgrown and hidden much of what we see out there. There still are some large gravel piles from the mining. I'm standing right on the Boreas Pass road. You'd take a turn right about here to go up Boreas Pass. This is turning the other way and looking south out into South Park. And you'll see, again, these cut banks with all the gravels. You'll see long sluices that were being run where the gravels were collecting that gold. And we see what becomes the Union Pacific Railroad on its way up to Boreas Pass. Now, today, again, very similar view. Again, the railroad obviously is no longer there. That is the Boreas Pass Road. And we see most everything covered, but still some of those gravel piles poking through from the work of all those Chinese men. This one, I don't have a modern day photo just because the trees have all interfered with it, but we're looking up towards the north again. And we see this would be that large dam that he built, the sluice boxes and the large cut banks of the plastering that he's been doing here. The Union Pacific Railroad would be right about up here after it wraps around. And if anybody's ever stayed in Robert's cabin, sits right around here, a Forest Service cabin that you can rent. Leland Peabody had his house right on in the middle of Hamilton, which was kind of a ghost town at that time. And I say ghost town, he actually had probably 50 Chinese living in those buildings. That's where they were housed during their working time. And so again, we see the railroad going over the top, and today pretty much overgrown and there's nothing left. All right, we'll move on to Tarryall Hall. This man was kind of unusual in that he made his fortune out here on silver mining, and that there was virtually no silver other than that associated with the actual gold, amalgamated with the gold. And he came out in 1860 and headed over to the Alma area to what was called Buckskin Gulch at the time. He was a popular guy. By 1870, he was the sheriff of Park County. And in 1872, he stakes what becomes one of the richest silver finds in Park County, the Dolly Varden discovery. For the next several decades, he then becomes, and that mine becomes one of the bellwethers for the silver fortunes of Park County. And as you know, the silver prices were not very stable through the late 1800s. And so he took some of his profits and bought into the Tarryall gold prospects. And he buys out W.J. Curtis, one of the leaders of the original Discoverers Band. This is a picture early on after he's purchased it. We see 4 or 5 Chinese men there working the sluices. And then we also see a guard. The Chinese were not well appreciated by the large white population there because obviously they were working for $1 when everyone else was working for $3. So if you did hire them, you often had to have a guard standing and protecting your workers. Well, Tarryall Hall goes looking for international investment to really build the larger infrastructure that this gold mining is going to require. And he finds a group out of London called Novo Mond Gold Company. And with their money, he hires a man named John Fortune to come over and manage this Tarryall placer. And I just think that's the greatest name for a gold miner would be John Fortune. And he was a mining engineer, and he'd come into this area from the gold rush in the Black Hills in 1884. And he moves to start looking at and building up the hydraulic system in Alma, just over the Alma would sit right about over here. So just over the ridge from Mount Silver Heels. This is a picture of that Alma placer. And again, it just gives you the idea of the scale of the amount of gravel that's being moved and washed through these sluice boxes to recover just those little minute amounts of gold. And just the intense amount of manpower that was needed in these things, we'll highlight that by zooming up here. You see like 6 guys on their hands and knees, and they're literally picking through the bedrock, the cracks and the crevices where the gold is going to be richest at the bottom of this pile of gravel. And so just a very intensive, work-intensive operation. And he begins with a serious help to manage the Tarryall placers, and this would be a picture of that. Again, this is around 1912, so much of the mining has been done. But again, you just see the prodigious amounts of gravel that have been moved at that time. Well, the relationship between the investor and the Fortune Hall group was not exactly what I'd call smooth. And for over a year, you have just daily almost telegraphs coming from John Fortune saying, give us money, we need money to build this up. In fact, this says, mining should have commenced 10 days ago, will not start until money comes. And so I've discovered several of these. I own several of these telegrams, but there's just piles of these coming from Fortune to the London investors. And similarly, every week, the group from London would say, well, what are you finding? Tell us something. You know, I've got investors. I can't just be sending money without some results. And so we would have weekly notes from Novomont, which had changed their name by then to the Tarryall Creek Gold Mining Company. And this kept on for well over a year. This letter from 1890 documents the London group's response. They said, okay, we've had these telegrams and we just want to make sure that we read them right. So on July 13th, you said you're washing the gravel and it's rich. 3 days later, washing fast, gravel looks good. July 29th, cleaning bedrock, the gravel is rich, water is good. You had to have water out there, you're done mining. And then disaster struck in September, not 5,000 ounces of gold went missing. And this is a New York Times article talking about a gold shipment missing. 5,000 ounces due in England, which do not arrive. And so this is a mystery until I think I've dug to the bottom. I was able to get some of the original documents, obviously from Tarryall Hall and some of those groups, and sleuth through that. And if you buy my book, you'll figure out what I'm guessing it was. In 1894, this essentially bankrupts the Novomont group. And John Fortune, because he wasn't paid for his work there, was awarded the entire 561-acre placer. And it became known as the Fortune Placer. Now, he and Tarryall Hall put together a brochure and went out looking for more investors, which I thought was kind of gutsy once they'd already bankrupted one company. But this is from that brochure. It's and you can see all of the infrastructure that they have through here, the dams and the canals and ditches to wash the gold down in here. And this was made in 1894. Just compare that to the Tarryall Ranches subdivision, which this patented claim was divided in 1966. And the reason for my real interest in this is my wife and I have a cabin on that spot, and we think it's the most beautiful spot in the world. Well, let's take a little closer look at Fortune's map, and similarly look at kind of what was the components of that hydraulic system. We have the three tributaries there, the North Tarryall, Middle Tarryall, and South Tarryall coming together. And then we have a whole series of ditches intercepting all of these streams much further to the north. And we have the dams. And we have this is all coming out of Colorado School of Mines also, this neat graph showing the gradient of the streams, those three streams. It shows the gradient, you can't see it's under this right here, but the gradient of the ditches that were from the upstream positions. And then you can see all these boards are from the flumes that come off of that stream. That was taken about 2 weeks ago when I was out fishing, but a lot of those flumes still exist out there, just in a poor state of repair, obviously. And then you connected that flume down to the stream, and this is a large, about a 20-inch pipeline that goes down that hill. And you can imagine the high pressure of water that they're getting at the placer faces, bringing that water from so far upstream. And lastly, you'd see here the gold, the placer deposits in the areas that were mainly being worked for this gold. And like I did on Liebelt, I went all over here. Not many areas I didn't cover here. And you can just see the complexity of the ditch system that's in place today. The gates and the flumes and the towers all still in place. Just a picture of some of the pipelines down towards the actual placer face, and one of the old cabins that was in place to manage that. All right, we're going to go look at the lode miners. There's only one I'm going to cover today, but obviously in any gold strike, placer strike, what you do is go upstream and look for those veins of gold, the mother lode possibly. And so similar to the announcements that were made on the placers, there was plenty of announcements of rich discoveries up in the lode area. But in 1860, they said the greatest puzzle, no lead or quartz rock has been found. This is the Rocky Mountain News. So even though there would be coming some really great samples from there, they had not early on found anything that would give them a sense they'd found the mother lode. This is one of the highest cabins I've found, and it's looking right down the valley. So here's one of the lode miners' cabins. This is well above tree line, which sits about here. And you can see all your way down into South Park. And then Pikes Peak is sitting about 65 miles to the southeast. Now, another example of some of the samples here, the mineral lode, which is one of the richer lodes, was sampled at 8.75 ounces of gold per ton. And today, if you found even a half ounce of gold per ton, you'd be just ecstatic if it was covered an extensive area. And so this is one of the mills that was built for processing those ores. And here's another example. In 1887, these two men, Martin and Malthus, found this vein called the Mineral Ranch vein, and they assayed it at 24 ounces of gold per ton. And they built what became kind of the iconic Tarryall Valley mining structure. This we call the shaft house, until a year and a half, when finally 140 years of snow and wind took that down. So I've just really been glad that I was able to preserve a lot of the things that are sitting out there today, to interview many of the miners or miners' families, some of whom have passed away, just like this shaft house. Well, this is one of the more colorful characters that came along. His name was Bonnie Look, and I called him the Jeff Bezos of early Denver. He was really smart. He realized by 1895 or so, the railroads had provided tendrils into all parts of the state. And he thought, why do I need to build a brick and mortar merchandise mart in every town? I'll just build a large warehouse by Union Station downtown, and I'll just put advertisements in every little local paper for everything, for groceries, for liquor, for furniture, the whole thing. And you can imagine this didn't really make him a very popular figure for those merchandisers in the countryside, but it did make him a fair fortune. And here along 1895, which is where this is taken from, if you know Colorado history, you know that Cripple Creek is really going strong at that time. And so certainly Bonnie Look is looking for an opportunity to get into some investments with his grocery and merchandising business, or dollars. And so he goes in and he buys into the Tarryall Valley, and it has a number of claims back there. And he has his brother, you think Bonnie I. Look is a funny name. His other brother was named I.B. Look, and one was John P. Look. So he had two brothers, and they all went back with some more help and started mining back there. And they really wouldn't hit anything until 1911. And this is just an announcement of the rich gold strike in the Tarryall Placer Mining District, where they found it says hundreds of dollars in yellow nuggets that the Look brothers found. Well, what did they do? This is the location today of that discovery, and the remnants of one of the houses there. And this is one of their workers. His name was Charlie Heil, and he's working that claim. This was actually, he was working it all the way up into the Depression. Well, they took that gold and they decided, we're going to go and find this mother lode. We're going to find where this gold came from. And so they started a tunnel, which became known as the Look Tunnel. And they were heading straight for that shaft house that I'd pictured before, and the 24 ounces of gold per ton. So they were going to invest the gold they'd found in placer mining into the Look Tunnel. This is a picture of the same area today. And there's a question, in all these mining districts, there'll always be rumors and legends. And there was always a question of whether those guys, did they find the Mineral Ranch lode, whatever happened in that tunnel. And I was fortunate enough to find this map, not very well preserved, out at the Colorado School of Mines again. And this is, by now, this is called the Ute Tunnel. And one of the Look brothers is a director in that company. And this shows the location of that surface at it, and all the way to the shaft house. And so you see the tunnel as it was drilled right through here. Now, I had gone to the surface of that and looked at where they had sampled, and I had done some geology, taking strikes and dips and projecting where would that exactly have been hit in the subsurface, and would it have hit this tunnel? And my prediction actually came right exactly there. And what you see is they were heading to the west, and all of a sudden they turned almost 90 degrees and followed that, and then came back up and headed back to the west. And so what it appears to me is that they were drifting on, they found that vein or that sill of gold, and it just didn't assay to the amount that they were hoping. And so they turned around and kept going to get under that shaft house. So just a great example of how, man, if you have any of these old maps, donate them somewhere where, people can use them for future reference. All right, that brings us up to the Depression. And many of you know that in 1933, Roosevelt requires every citizen to sell their gold coin and bullion at that $20.67 an ounce. Within just a few months, the Gold Reserve Act raises the price of that now captured gold to $35 an ounce. That was a smooth move there. So what happened at that point is you have this gold rush going back to the old gold fields with now this inflated value of gold. And we're seeing a picture right here of one of the federal programs where they were offering mining classes. This is the South Platte River. And you have men, women, and probably children out there learning how to gold pan. This is a graph of tons per year of US gold from 1900 to 2022. And you can see what I call Roosevelt's rush right here. That's 1934. You get a surge. And then this is World War II. And in 1942, the government shut down all gold mining as non-essential. Well, into this Depression era came a man named Edward Ames out of San Antonio. He's a geologist, an oilman, and mining engineer. And he may have had some investors behind him, but he comes in and purchases the entire Leland Peabody's ranch. And he also leases the Fortune Placer and the Foster Klein Ranch. So he has 4,000 acres of leases of prime gold, of what was historically prime gold ground. And he gives that option to these two men called the Cooley brothers out of Missouri. And they're largely gravel miners. And they had just started poking around in Colorado and doing some dredge mining. So they bring in what's called a dragline and a dredge. And in 1941 to 42, they mined the Peabody and Hamilton placers. Shut down by World War II, they came back in 46 and 47, and they relocated their dredge downstream to this area, which is called the Klein Bench. And this gives a picture of that operation. Some of you are familiar with dredges. This isn't really the classic dredge. It doesn't have the large scoops or belted scoops out in front digging the gravel. Instead, it's a separate drag line that is digging the gravel, dumping it into the hopper there, and the whole wash plant is separating the gold from the gravels. Now, a lot of odd things. This drag line, it's got 2 feet that it walks on, and it's powered. This seems like a really bad idea around this water, but it's powered by electricity, and that's the cord right there. Just to give you an idea of how isolated this is, they had to run a 14-mile line into Fairplay to get electricity to this area. And even today, there's no electricity at that spot. Well, this is the last view we have of Hamilton. And the reason is that the Cooley brothers had the permission to mine their way through that entire town. And so they took the entire thing down. Over their 4 years, they recovered almost 14,000 ounces, which today would be worth $41 million. Just another photo of that drag line and the wash plant and the huge spoil piles. This is a little Baldy Mountain. You'd be going up towards Silver Hills right here. And today, you can still see all of those piles from that dredging operation still there. Well, kind of in conclusion, some of the mapping I've done, this gives you an idea of all the flumes and ditches I mapped in red, all of the placer mines that were historically made out here, named, and then I've included the history in my book. And then we see also where the Cooley brothers were operating to the south. I made sure I mapped every mine that I came across, even though lode mining was not tremendously successful. There were over 200 lode mines that were attempted in this area. And so these red dots you can see are all of those mines. You can see they're largely concentrated in these grayed out areas. These are the patented claims. Those are still privately owned. And so that's all, essentially everything on this area that is gray is privately owned. And much of the areas in between are active leases as well, or active claims as well. You see the mill sites, there were 6 of those in the blue balls. And then the blue lines here are the tramways taking the gold or the samples down to be milled at the mill sites. Most of these mines are going to be collapsed. There are a few that are still open today, but it was just really a lot of fun looking for those. Over 125 cabin ruins are still existing up in along the Tarryall, up in that area. And you can see, again, most of them are concentrated on patented claims, but this is Boreas Pass Road up here, and you can see some just right off the road that are still existing in those locations. Gives you an idea of what some of them look like. The best one right here is called the Link Cabin. And then we have the Lee Belt Barn right here, and some more of the Lee Belt area. And this is up on Selkirk right off of Boreas Pass. I also took a look, and every time I ran into a prospect pit, I mapped it. And this helps you to give an idea of where did they look and where did they not find things. And so it's very important. It's probably a more important exploration tool, or equally important, is where the mines actually were. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of these, obviously, across the area. And this is what those look like. This is kind of like a lunar crater out there. Some of them are big enough to, put a Volkswagen Bug in. Some of them are about a suitcase size. So they vary all over. Some of them were dug, and some of them they used explosives to get down to bedrock, where they would pan that entire interval down to bedrock just to see whether there was gold there or not. All right, so always get the question, is there any gold left? And so I include this map. This was made by Ben Parker, Jr. in his dissertation thesis in 1960 out at the Colorado School of Mines. And he looked at all the placers across Colorado that were really commercial, good placers. And these contours show the richest gold that were mapped at the time of the Coulee dredge coming through here. And every one of these tiny little dots are drill holes. They drilled hundreds and hundreds of these small holes to map the distribution of the gold out there. So this is a gold distribution map. And if you'll just keep your eye on these dark areas, that's where the richest gold was. And I overlaid that with an aerial photo showing where the Coulee dredge came in 1941 and 42. They came along here. They were shut down by World War II. They pulled their dredge all the way up here and dry docked it until after the war. And they came back and got 5,000 ounces of gold there. Well, if you're pretty astute, you'll notice there's something missing here. I call it the Ames treasure, and it's probably $5 to $10 million worth of gold still on the ground out in that area. So if you're so inclined, there's plenty of spare equipment out there. It'll probably, with the environmental regulations, there probably won't be much done with that. But with that, I'd like to just say, Tarryall Gold from Rush to Hush. This is most of you, or many thousands of people, rush this valley every fall and climb that Boreas Pass in search of the golden aspen. And hopefully, if you have that opportunity, you'll look back and you'll think of generations before and a different kind of gold that was found here, and in the process built this beautiful state that we call home. So I'd like to thank my wife, Lenora, sitting right back there, and also the number of library, the Denver Public Library, History Colorado. Much of the information I got came from these, as well as the Colorado School of Mines. There's a list of several of the grandchildren, great-grandchildren of some of these miners that I was able to interview. Christy Wright and Jerry Davis are prominent historians out in the Park County area. And then my Tarryall Ranch neighbors, who were more or less friendly with me, poking around. And then my publisher, Rhyolite Press out of Colorado Springs, Don Kloss and Susie Schorsch, and Bob DeWitt, who provided me with all the business papers of Cereal Hall. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and for your attendance. And I'll take questions. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to run through. Yes, Don. Okay, sure.
Questions about the miners. So was it just the Chinese population, or were there other like European, like non-Welsh, because it's primarily Welsh?
Yeah.
But what other ethnic or nationalities did you find?
Well, in this area, the primary were who were the main immigrants? What different groups other than the Chinese might have come out in this area? I would say in this area it was primarily the Italians. And the reason for that, the reason why Como is where it is there were great coal deposits there. So that when the railroads came out in 1879, they put their roundhouse there. And I'll make a pitch for Como's railroad days coming up in a couple Saturdays at that roundhouse. But they had coal mines just to the north, right next to the cemetery. And then the large town of King, just to the south of that, a huge Union Pacific coal mine that supplied coal for much of central Colorado early on. And the Italians were the main, or initially the Italians were the main workers in those mines. They were very dangerous mines. One explosion killed like 23 Italians who were all buried in that Como cemetery. And that at the time, again, some of these folks weren't really highly thought of. And so they just went back to mining again until they killed 26 Chinese in the next explosion. And that pretty much shut down those mines. But yeah, I'd say the Chinese and the Italians were the main work group right in this area. And I think Italians in Leadville as well were quite a prominent group as well. Yes.
The mining happens over such a long period of time, stretches of decades back in time. And you alluded to some of this in your talk, but can you give us a big picture sense of how the land gets claimed and then does or doesn't revert to public ownership? I saw Pike National Forest comes in at some point, so can you just give us a sense of what's public, what's private, and how that works?
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit. The question has to do with public and private land, how you got the claims, how this whole thing was claimed up or they were lost. So essentially when the miners came in, it was kind of a free-for-all. Every mining district set up their own rules. So even though each miner got about 100 feet of creek bottom on the placer deposits in the up and around Idaho Springs and Central City, that wasn't a rule across, well, there wasn't a state, right? So you had a mining district, you had rules of the mining district, and typically, because of those Gregory diggings and everything, they came out, the miners who came from that would bring the rules with them as far as how much they could claim. So the discoverer usually got 200 feet, and the rest of the people would get 100, after that would get 100 feet. And that was for placer claims. And the mining actual law, there were several mining laws then that's covered, some covered placer and some covered the load claim. And I believe the main one was in 1872 or 74 that said how many acres you could take. Some of these, like Lee Belt, I showed you that 16-acre claim. That would be far too big for one man to take, except I've seen the claim papers and there were 20 men that took it. And the next day they all quit claim that their claim to Mr. Lee Belt. And that happened all the time over here where people captured quite a bit of land. If they'd worked it long enough, there was a process called patenting your claim. And I compare it very much to homesteading, what was going on. So it was federal land, or, if you look at Minnesota, where I come from, right, the immigrants came in. If they worked a certain section of land, a quarter section for a certain number of years, it was signed over to them, and that was called homesteading. In this case, they would be able to put a certain amount of work in and prove that. You saw the houses and the ditches and all those types of things in their surveys, and they would be able to patent that. And they were given the land. And so just like farms today that were homesteaded, stay in the family, right? You pay your property taxes and you keep it, and you can buy and sell those. Same thing with patented claims. They are owned today. Some of them are still in the families of the original, or not maybe the original miners, but miners from certainly the 1880s and 1890s. And so, for instance, a man named John Sweetland, who's on those credits, he passed away about a year and a half ago. He was one of the guys that really inspired me out here. His grandfather was a miner in the 30s, and he had thousands of acres that had come from his grandfather, some of whom he'd bought off of tax lien sales. People went away and just wouldn't pay their taxes. And so there is some turnover to those private claims in that way, but you can no longer patent. The patent process was stopped, I think it was in the early 90s. So you can no longer patent claims. But if you were to go out on used Forest Service land and you were to find a creek that was not claimed, and you'd have to make sure before you went on that it was either not a patented claim or an active claim. And let's say you found some gold and you decide, I wanted to make a claim here. You can make an active claim, and you make a yearly payment. Basically, you do not own that ground. Anybody can go on it. Anybody can walk over it and hike on it. They can't take anything out of it. It is actually, the gold in there is your gold as long as you're paying that fee and are mining it. So that's when I say there's a family out of Dallas-Fort Worth. They used to own the Star Telegram or something, and the Texas Rangers, and a very wealthy family called the Carter family. This was mined all the way up into the 1980s, and that Texas family was an investor in one of those operations that turned out to be kind of a scam. And the Carter family took over several thousand acres back in here of both patented land and active claims. And they've been making those payments since the 1980s to hold that land together. So much of the very upper part of this is actually, it's gated and locked. They've had patrols out there before. So when John Sweetland offered to sell me a couple of claims, that gave me a key that opened up this whole area for my my exploration. And so does that answer? Yes.
Locking private just because they don't want people walking across their land. I mean, they're not mining it.
Yeah, the short answer is this is Park County, and if you know Park County, they're kind of a different breed up there, and but it's their land, right? And so they have the right to keep people off. Now it's interlaced with Forest Service land, so obviously they cannot keep you off Forest Service land, and they cannot even keep you off active claims, right? You can walk across that. It's the access, you know, if you want to climb up and over Mount Silver Hills and stay on public land, you can get in there. Or hike in other ways. I suppose there's no way of stopping that. But again, you know, people ask, and I've had permission from those families to go out back and try my luck at tanning. And one of the things that John Parker said in his mapping was, if the Chinese worked an area, go somewhere else. And that's literally true. I mean, you might find a flake or crumb, but these areas were really, really mined hard. And there's really, other than that Ames treasure that I have up there, you know, and that Ames treasure, when they were mining that, they bulldozed off about 5 feet of just barren dirt, right, before they got started getting to the gold. And then it went about 15 or 20 feet below that. So it's not something that is going to be easily, you know, go out and dig a little bit. But I do get that question. Everybody's curious and everybody loves to go out and try.
I'm not quite certain about the process. I mean, they get 100 feet of Placer Creek bed, but they're allowed to go up the mountain and establish all these flumes and everything like that to bring water down, because it's the pressure of the water that basically jets gravels.
Right.
Washes all the sediments out of it. Is that how it works?
Yeah, so the question would be, so you've got the actual claims, but sometimes they're capturing water coming off of those claims and onto those claims. So how did they do that? You know, they would have water rights. I mean, water rights come with these, and some of the families, again, still, which are hugely valuable. The city of Aurora has bought most of the water rights up here. But you could go up and intercept that creek hundreds of feet higher than your placer face. And as long as you saw that one where they kept that flume, really, I mean, you're flowing downhill, but just barely, right? So that when the creek is going at a certain gradient and your flume is going at a much less gradient, when you get to the placer face, now your water is 100 feet above your placer. And so if you can put that in a pipeline and into those water cannons, you can just roll boulders down the hill, and that's why you see all the gravels broken up like you do. Yes.
Archives of financial information on any of the mining companies?
You know, let me think about that. The question is, did I find any financial archives of the mining companies? Bits and pieces of that Ute mining company. Most of the lode companies, as it would turn out, you know, some of them put in tunnels that were 1,000 feet. I mean, there was some pretty good effort out there, but usually you'd find reports later on when they got an actual mineral or a mining engineer out there. A lot of people would sign their names ME as like in mining expert, but it was confused with mining engineers. So you could be a mining expert and go make an opinion and people might think you knew what you were doing. And so you'd have mining experts making all these great prognostications. And then 2 or 3 years later, after they hadn't found anything and the investors were getting impatient, they'd bring in a mining engineer and he'd say, you know, what were you thinking here? So you do have those types of things as far as how much was found. Certainly the Cooley dredge, John Parker was able to get into the files of the Cooley brothers, who were still active in the Front Range. You've seen maybe behind Aspen Grove is Cooley Lake. They dredged all that gravel for the building projects here, but he was able to get their actual, that's why I had it down to the very ounce that they were able to recover. Certainly before the 1870s, the records are really tough to make. You know, there was gold going back to England, there was gold going back east. Some of it was monitored by the Wells Fargo and the different shipping agencies. But in terms of coming real close to how much was found on an individual mine, there's some little bits in the Bureau of Mines in the early 1900s of 7 ounces from here and 2 ounces from here in the lode mining. But I think a lot of the placer was not well publicized. And I've looked at the mint records as well, to get a sense for the Denver Mint, what came into the mint, and I was hoping I could find down to the ounce what Peabody turned in. But they would have brokers that would go through these gold fields, collect it, and go deposit it in the Denver Mint, and it never says in the records who it came from. So I had Mr. Liebelt depositing 6 ounces of gold the day before he picked up his new bride in the Denver Mint. So you'd find some fun things like that. But as far as getting it down to, I say 200 to 300 million. I see that today the gold price is $3,400 an ounce. That was calculated on 3,000 an ounce. So I'm out of date already, but yeah.
Another question?
All right.
It has been a fantastic presentation. Not only a great presentation, and actually you had some kudos here from people. Let me see. Actually, there was a question from somebody. Terrific history of the valley. As you, I also have some land on the valley that overlooks Tarryall Creek and faces Mount Silver Hills. So nice to hear about some creek conservation recently. Thank you.
Yes.
How can I purchase a copy of the book?
Okay. Well, down on the steps afterwards, but not for you folks offline. So I'm going to be, I've talked to the Barnes and Nobles and looked at the Amazon thing. This book is 330 pages long. It's got 220 color photos, and Rhyolite did a great job. It's kind of a niche publisher. So it's an expensive book. And when you put Amazon fees and Barnes and Noble fees on top, it becomes almost unsellable. So I've decided to market it completely through, we're doing just really limited printings out of Minneapolis, one of the top art book printers in the nation. And we're going to distribute it for time, at least for the time. It came out in May of this year. Just through talks like this, we're going to be at Railroad Days and selling it. I've got a Facebook page called Tarryall Gold, and I have my whole schedule of talks there. So we've been in Gunnison, we've been in Como, we've been at different places across the state. But if they message me on that, we're trying to figure out a way to make it a bigger distribution. But right now we're pretty happy with kind of being a small group, and having this type of thing has really been a lot of fun. It's not been if you've ever published books, it's not a money-making deal. It's just I just love the whole process, and it's been a lot of fun.
Not only a great presentation, but the amount of work that it went into putting it all together. Only a geologist from the Colorado Gold Mines could do that.
There you go.
Thank you much. Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you for